Hello there, friend. I am really glad you decided to stop by tonight. Go ahead, get comfortable, maybe grab yourself a warm drink, pull up a blanket and settle in. Because tonight, we are going to travel back in time. Not just through dates and facts, but through the heartbeat of history itself. And before we begin this long journey, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. It really helps keep these deep dives alive. And it tells me that you want more cozy nights like this one, exploring the world's most mysterious and transformative stories. Now let us begin. The year is 1347. Europe is a patchwork of kingdoms, cities, and small villages, most people living quiet, simple lives. The smell of wood smoke drifts from chimneys, children chase each other through muddy streets, and church bells echo through the valleys. People tend their crops, trade at markets, and pray for good harvests. The rhythm of life is steady, familiar, and deeply rooted in faith. Few could imagine that within just a few short years, this familiar world would be torn apart, that something unseen, something silent and relentless, would sweep across the continent and change everything forever. It began far away on the edge of Europe's awareness, in the great trade routes that stretched from the distant lands of China, through the deserts of Central Asia, and into the bustling ports of the Mediterranean. Merchants traveled these routes constantly, carrying silk, spices, and precious goods. But among their cargo, something else traveled with them, something they could not see. The disease began somewhere in the vast Mongol Empire, where reports spoke of towns collapsing in sickness, of bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. It moved westward with frightening speed, and when the ships of Genoese traders docked in the Sicilian port of Messina in the autumn of 1347, they brought with them not only their wares but death itself. At first, no one understood what was happening. The sailors arrived feverish and trembling, their skin blotched with dark swellings, buboes that oozed and stank. Within days, the disease spread through the port. People collapsed in the streets, their bodies racked with pain, their breath foul and shallow. The terrified townsfolk shut their doors, but it was too late. The sickness moved from house to house, from town to town, invisible and unstoppable. In just a few weeks, Messina was overwhelmed. Ships fled, hopping to escape the pestilence. But as they sailed to new ports, they carried the horror with them. To Genoa, to Venice, to Marseille, to Barcelona, to every corner of the Mediterranean world. Imagine for a moment being there, a merchant standing on the docks of Venice as a ship drifts into port. You hear the creak of wood and the flap of sails, but the deck is silent. The crew does not call out. As you approach, you see them lying still, faces pale, eyes open but lifeless. The air smells of salt and rot. A rat scurries down the gangplank and disappears into the maze of narrow streets. And with that single rat, the city's fate is sealed. People had no idea what was happening. They called it many names: the Great Mortality, the Pestilence, the Black Death. Some believed it was punishment from God for humanity's sins. Others thought it was carried on foul air or caused by the alignment of the planets. Doctors tried to explain it, but their knowledge of medicine was rooted in ancient theories, and nothing they did seemed to help. They bled patients, burned herbs, prayed, and fled. But the sickness followed them everywhere. It spread inland into France and Spain, then northward toward England and the German states. Everywhere it went, it left devastation in its wake. In some towns, entire families died in their homes, and no one dared to enter. In others, priests and monks tried to give the dying their last rites, but soon they too fell ill. The dead lay unburied because there were no healthy men left to dig graves. Dogs and pigs wandered the streets, feeding on the corpses. The air grew thick with the stench of death. In England, the plague arrived in the summer of 1348, likely through the port of Melcombe Regis. It spread like wildfire, moving inland along the roads and rivers. By the time it reached London, the great city was already trembling. Chroniclers wrote that half of its people were dead within months. The bells of churches tolled constantly, marking yet another soul lost to the sickness. Fires burned day and night, meant to purify the air, but nothing stopped the spread. Across Europe, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population perished. Whole villages vanished. In some places, the only survivors were children, wandering among the ruins of their homes. Those who lived through it found their world forever changed. With so many dead, fields went untilled, harvests rotted in the ground, and food grew scarce. Trade halted, prices rose. The feudal system that had defined Europe for centuries began to crack. Lords, desperate for workers, had to offer better wages and conditions to peasants who had survived. Suddenly, the rigid structure of medieval society loosened. The poor began to demand more rights. And yet, even amidst all that horror, life went on. People adapted. Some turned to faith with greater intensity, believing only prayer could save them. Others lost faith entirely, convinced that God had abandoned the world. There were those who joined flagellant movements, men who roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in penance, begging for forgiveness for the sins of mankind. Others turned on minorities, particularly Jewish communities, accusing them falsely of poisoning wells or causing the plague through witchcraft. Thousands were massacred in waves of paranoia and hate. The Black Death did not just kill people, it unmade the very fabric of medieval life. Art, literature, and religion all changed. The dance of death, that haunting image of skeletons leading people of all classes to their graves, became a powerful symbol in paintings and poetry. Writers spoke of the fleeting nature of life, of the suddenness of death. The church, once the unshakable pillar of authority, found itself weakened. Many clergy had died, and people began to question the wisdom of those who had survived. Some sought new spiritual paths, paving the way for movements that would one day challenge the church's power entirely. At the same time, science, still in its infancy, began to stir. Observers realized that disease followed patterns, that it spread along trade routes, that it did not strike at random. Though it would take centuries for germ theory to emerge, the Black Death planted the first seeds of empirical thinking. People began to wonder whether human reason might uncover the mysteries of the world, rather than faith alone. When the worst finally passed, the survivors stepped into a changed Europe. The labor shortages transformed economies. Entire towns were rebuilt with new layouts. In England, the peasantry grew bolder, leading to revolts and reforms that slowly eroded feudal power. In Italy, the immense loss of life gave rise to new ways of thinking about humanity, life, and art, the beginnings of what we now call the Renaissance. The plague, in its own terrible way, cleared the ground for modern Europe to grow. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, are we not? Because the story of the Black Death is not only about how it changed history, it is about how it felt to live through it. Imagine the fear that hung in the air. Imagine a mother clutching her child, praying as fever burns through the night. Imagine the silence that follows, when the streets that once rang with laughter are quiet except for the tolling of bells and the buzz of flies. For those who survived, every breath must have felt borrowed, every sunrise a small miracle. And yet humanity endured. People rebuilt their lives, their homes, and their hopes. Out of death came renewal. Out of despair came invention. The Black Death destroyed much, but it also forced change, social, spiritual, and intellectual. It was, in many ways, the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the world that would one day become our own. When the Great Plague waves began to fade, Europe did not sigh in relief right away. The people who remained looked around and saw that their world had become unfamiliar. Empty houses stood like silent ghosts of families who once laughed inside them. In the countryside, wildflowers grew tall over abandoned villages. Fields that had been carefully plowed for generations now lay untouched, their furrows softened by rain and time. The survivors walked through these places in quiet disbelief, wondering how life could ever return to what it was. In truth, it never did. The Black Death had left deep scars, but it also created strange new possibilities. For centuries, most peasants had been bound to the land, tied to the estates of their lords. They worked the fields, paid rents, and owed labor in return for protection. But when nearly half of Europe's population vanished, the entire system trembled. There were simply not enough hands to bring in the harvest, to build, to bake, to trade. Suddenly, the survivors discovered that their labor had more value than ever before. A farmer who once toiled for scraps could now bargain. A craftsman who survived could demand higher pay. Lords who once ruled with iron certainty now found themselves begging for workers. In England, this imbalance gave rise to something extraordinary, the beginning of a new sense of individual worth among the lower classes. Workers began moving from one estate to another, searching for better wages. The government tried to stop this with laws like the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349 and the Statute of Laborers a few years later, demanding that wages remain frozen at pre-plague levels. But you cannot stop a tide with parchment. Peasants simply ignored the laws and resentment began to simmer. A generation later, in 1381, that frustration exploded into open revolt, the Peasants' Revolt, led by figures like Wat Tyler. It was not a success in the immediate sense, but it was a warning. The old order of feudalism was dying. On the continent, the pattern repeated in its own way. In France, labor shortages forced landowners to offer leases and freedoms that would have been unthinkable a few decades earlier. In Italy, the bustling merchant cities began to dominate even more as trade slowly revived. The balance of power shifted away from the nobility and toward a growing middle class of merchants, bankers, and artisans. It was the faint outline of something entirely new, the society that would later flourish in the Renaissance. But social change was only one part of the transformation. The Black Death also changed how people thought about life, death, and meaning. Before the plague, religion had been the cornerstone of existence. The church was not merely a place to pray, it was the very structure of the world, the lens through which all events were understood. Yet during those dark years, when priests and bishops died as readily as peasants, many began to wonder if divine protection had failed. Some saw it as God's wrath. Others began to whisper that perhaps the church did not hold all the answers after all. In some towns, faith deepened into feverish devotion. People built shrines, carried relics, and marched in endless processions, begging heaven for mercy. But in others, cynicism crept in. Survivors looked at the lavish cathedrals and the wealth of bishops and asked themselves whether such grandeur truly reflected the will of God. This quiet skepticism would grow over the next centuries, eventually fueling reform movements that would shake the foundations of Europe. Martin Luther, John Wycliffe, and others would find fertile soil in the disillusionment that the plague had planted. Art, too, changed. Before the Black Death, much of medieval art had been serene, symbolic, and devoted to religious subjects. Afterward, a new fascination with death and the fragility of life spread across Europe. Painters began to include skeletons, skulls, and grim reapers in their work, reminders that death came for all, from kings to peasants. Murals of the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, appeared on church walls, showing skeletal figures leading men and women of every station in one grim procession toward the grave. It was both terrifying and strangely comforting, a reminder that death was the one thing all humanity shared. Writers, too, found their voices shaped by the catastrophe. In Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, a series of tales told by 10 young people who flee Florence to escape the plague. The stories are witty, human, sometimes scandalous, and deeply revealing of a world trying to find laughter again after unimaginable sorrow. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales would later echo the same tone, a mosaic of voices, earthy and alive, exploring human nature in all its contradictions. The plague had stripped away illusions of perfection, leaving behind an art that was more honest, more human. And yet the Black Death did more than change culture. It changed the very rhythm of daily life. Cities began to rethink their design. Narrow medieval streets where filth and rats thrived were slowly replaced by broader avenues, better drainage, and early attempts at sanitation. Hospitals, once merely places for the dying to find spiritual comfort, began to evolve into centers of care and observation. The first steps toward public health were hesitant, but they were steps nonetheless. In some places, Governments began keeping records of deaths, quarantines, and port inspections, the early seeds of what we now call epidemiology. The city of Venice established one of the first quarantine stations on a nearby island, where ships had to wait 40 days before entering port, 40 giorni, from which we get the word quarantine. It was a sign that Europe was learning, slowly, painfully, to respond with reason as well as fear. Economically, the effects were just as profound. The sudden scarcity of labor did not only raise wages, it also encouraged innovation. Farmers experimented with new techniques, turning from grain to livestock, which required fewer hands. Merchants began using more efficient methods of record-keeping and trade. The demand for luxury goods among the survivors, many of whom inherited wealth from their deceased families, fueled new industries, especially in textiles and art. The foundations of capitalism, though still centuries from maturity, began to take root in the ashes of the plague. And through it all, the memory of those dark years never entirely faded. For generations afterward, people would tell stories of the time when death walked among them. Old folk songs spoke of the great sickness, and even in cities untouched by later outbreaks, the fear lingered. Every time a new illness appeared, whispers of the Black Death returned. It became a measure of catastrophe, the shadow against which all later disasters were compared. Now, centuries later, when we ask how the Black Death changed Europe forever, the answer lies in these intertwined threads. It did not only kill, it transformed. It broke apart old hierarchies, reshaped economies, inspired art and science, and opened the door to modern thinking. It forced humanity to look inward, to question, to rebuild, to adapt. The plague was not merely an event in history. It was a turning point in human consciousness. But our story is far from over, because beyond the sweeping changes of nations and systems, there were the quiet changes in hearts and homes. The way people viewed love, family, and destiny shifted too. They began to live differently, love differently, and see time itself as precious. After witnessing how easily life could vanish, many sought joy more fiercely than before. They married younger, celebrated more, built gardens, and painted frescoes full of color and light. Out of darkness came an almost desperate beauty. As the years passed after the last great wave of plague, Europe did something remarkable. It began to breathe again. The smell of fresh bread returned to market stalls. Bells rang for weddings instead of funerals, and new children were born who had never known the terror that their parents still carried inside them. These children grew up in a world that looked outward rather than inward. Their mothers and fathers had watched entire villages vanish. They had learned that life could change overnight, and that knowledge quietly reshaped how they raised the next generation. People began to value the present moment more keenly. A farmer who once labored from sunrise to sunset simply to pay his dues now found that his work earned him enough to keep his own household comfortable. He could afford a sturdier roof, perhaps even a painted chest or a fine cloak for feast days. His children learned to read, something their grandparents could scarcely imagine. In towns, merchants thrived on the growing trade between surviving ports. Ships sailed again, their sails patched but bright, and along with goods they carried new ideas. Italy, sitting at the crossroads of trade between East and West, felt these changes most strongly. Florence, Genoa, Venice, and Milan each had lost thousands of souls to the pestilence, but from that loss came a strange energy. The survivors were wealthier, their fortunes enlarged by inheritances from those who had died. Money that once lay idle in noble estates now flowed into the hands of merchants and bankers. Some of that wealth was used to rebuild churches or sponsor charities for the poor, but much of it went into art. The Florentine families who rose in this period, such as the Medici, grew up in a world still haunted by the plague's memory. They poured money into frescoes, sculptures, and architecture, as if to prove that beauty could still exist in a world touched by death. Painters began to study light and shadow more carefully. Sculptors looked at the human body with a sense of wonder rather than guilt, and architects revived the classical harmony of ancient Rome. This rediscovery of balance and proportion, of human dignity, became the pulse of what we now call the Renaissance. It is no coincidence that it took root in the very soil that had once been drenched in fear. Meanwhile, across the Alps, life changed in quieter ways. The church had suffered terribly during the Black Death, and it would take generations to recover its moral authority. Ordinary believers, seeing that priests and bishops could die as quickly as anyone else, began to take spiritual matters into their own hands. Personal prayer, private devotion, and the reading of scripture became more common. This quiet movement of inner faith prepared the way for later calls to reform. When men like Martin Luther spoke of corruption and the need for renewal, they found an audience already familiar with doubt. The plague had planted that doubt long before the theses were nailed to any door. The way Europeans thought about knowledge itself began to shift. Before the plague, explanations for disease and natural disaster came mostly from theology. Afterward, people started to look for patterns, for evidence. In the universities that survived, scholars began to question the old medical texts. They noted that isolation and cleanliness seemed to matter more than prayers or incense. City councils experimented with quarantines, burned infected bedding, and kept records of the sick. These were small steps, but they marked the beginning of a more empirical approach to understanding the world. Even the language of time changed. Chroniclers stopped counting years only by the reigns of kings or the feasts of saints and began to speak of before the pestilence and after the pestilence. It became a dividing line in memory. Before the pestilence, the world was narrow and certain. After it, the world was wider, more uncertain, but also full of possibility. In villages, traditions evolved. Harvest festivals that had once been solemn affairs of thanksgiving turned into lively dances. Songs carried both joy and melancholy, celebrating survival while remembering those who were gone. Families told stories of ancestors who had lived through the Great Sickness, how they had hidden in the woods, or nursed neighbors, or found courage when hope seemed lost. In this way, the plague became not just a tragedy but a source of family legend, a symbol of endurance. Throughout the 15th century, Europe's population slowly recovered. By the year 1450, many regions had returned to about two-thirds of their former numbers. Towns that had fallen silent began to hum again with industry. But this recovery was not a return to the old world. The distribution of wealth and power had shifted permanently. In England, the gradual erosion of serfdom continued. In France, centralized royal authority strengthened as noble families weakened. In the German states, free cities gained independence and influence. Everywhere, the old feudal bonds were replaced by contracts, wages, and written law. The landscape itself changed. Forests reclaimed abandoned farmland, but new clearings appeared elsewhere as demand for timber grew. Stone bridges replaced wooden ones, new mills were built, and roads improved. Commerce encouraged cooperation between regions that had once been isolated by distrust. Gold and silver from distant mines financed cathedrals and palaces whose walls were painted with images not only of saints, but also of merchants, scholars, and even humble artisans. The human being, not just the divine, was now worthy of portrayal. In this subtle shift from heaven to earth lay one of the deepest transformations the plague set in motion. The fragility of life had taught people to treasure the here and now. Artists studied anatomy, architects pursued symmetry, and poets wrote about earthly love with an intensity that would have shocked earlier centuries. The Renaissance celebration of the individual spirit, the conviction that a single human mind could grasp beauty, truth, and invention, was the echo of a time when death had made every life seem precious. Still, the memory of the Black Death was never far from the surface. When new outbreaks appeared, such as the plague that struck London in 1665, people responded with a mix of ancient fear and new practicality. They lit fires in the streets, burned incense, but also set up quarantines and counted the dead carefully. The lessons of the 14th century had not been forgotten. By changing the population so dramatically, the Black Death had even influenced the environment. Fewer people meant less pressure on farmland, and in some regions forests grew back, altering the climate slightly. Grain prices fluctuated, diets improved for those who survived, and in a curious way, the overall health of the population eventually rose. Nature, given a brief reprieve from human expansion, healed a little, even as humanity mourned its losses. All of these threads, the social upheaval, the questioning of faith, the rebirth of art, the stirrings of science, intertwined to form the tapestry of modern Europe. No single monarch or invention could claim credit for the change. It was the collective response of millions who had faced the same horror and chosen to rebuild differently. They had looked into the abyss and decided that life, however fragile, was worth understanding, celebrating, and improving. That is, perhaps, the truest answer to how the Black Death changed Europe forever. It forced a civilization that had lived largely for the next world to begin living for this one. It turned passive faith into active curiosity, obedience into negotiation, and suffering into creativity. Out of the stillness that followed the tolling of so many bells, Europe discovered its own voice. Even as the immediate horror of the Black Death faded, its shadow lingered across Europe for generations. It left a mark not only in demographic charts or economic patterns, but deep within the cultural imagination. Painters, sculptors, and writers returned again and again to its imagery, as if trying to make sense of what had once seemed incomprehensible. In towns from Florence to Prague, murals appeared showing skeletons dancing alongside kings, merchants, and peasants alike, a stark reminder that death was the great equalizer. These images were more than morbid decoration. They were collective meditation on mortality, a way for society to confront fear and preserve memory. Literature, too, bore witness to the crisis. The tales of Giovanni Boccaccio and the Decameron framed human behavior under the strain of catastrophe. 10 young men and women fled the city to escape plague, and in their storytelling, Boccaccio explored love, trickery, faith, and folly. These stories were not merely entertainment, they were reflections on resilience. They revealed the psychological and social consequences of mass death, how people sought comfort, clung to companionship, and sought meaning in a world suddenly so fragile. Across Europe, writers would continue to explore the tension between life's brevity and human aspiration, a theme first seared into collective consciousness by the Black Death. Science and medicine, though primitive by modern standards, also took a new turn. Physicians had failed during the plague, but they observed patterns of infection, routes of transmission, and the value of isolation. Port cities began documenting the sick and the dead with more precision than ever before. The notion that empirical observation could save lives began to take root. In Venice, Florence, and other maritime centers, authorities experimented with quarantines, fumigations, and public health measures. Though rudimentary, these efforts planted the seeds of epidemiology and public health systems that would later become fundamental to Europe's approach to disease. The Black Death also influenced religious life in subtle but powerful ways. While many turned to extreme piety or participated in flagellant processions, others lost trust in institutions that could not protect them. Monasteries and convents that had once held unquestioned authority sometimes lay empty or decayed, victims of mortality themselves. Laypeople began interpreting scripture for themselves, laying the groundwork for reform movements centuries later. Faith became more personal and introspective, rather than entirely mediated by the church. In this way, the plague reshaped spiritual life in ways that would echo through the Reformation and beyond. Artistic style evolved alongside these shifts in thought. Painters abandoned purely symbolic representations and embraced the human form with greater fidelity, often portraying the vulnerability and dignity of the body in life and in death. Sculptors experimented with perspective, proportion, and anatomy, seeking to capture the world as it was seen rather than as it was imagined. This shift toward realism and humanism reflected a Europe that had glimpsed mortality firsthand and realized that life, brief, fragile, and unpredictable, was to be observed and celebrated. On the political and social level, the changes wrought by the plague were equally profound. Entire villages had vanished, creating labor shortages that forced lords to renegotiate contracts and pay wages. Serfs gained leverage, townsfolk demanded representation, and rulers had to contend with a population more conscious of its value. In some regions, peasant revolts, most famously the English peasants' revolt of 1381, challenged entrenched authority. Across France, Germany, and Italy, the redistribution of labor and wealth weakened feudal bonds, strengthened urban centers, and encouraged mobility. Ordinary Europeans found that survival gave them a voice they had never possessed before. Even the most fundamental aspects of daily life changed. With fewer mouths to feed, diets improved. New agricultural techniques emerged. Homes were rebuilt with attention to hygiene and comfort. Survivors prized leisure and festivity, celebrating the gift of life in ways that had been unimaginable before the plague. Villagers organized fairs, feasts, and plays, embedding communal memory into ritualized celebration. In these customs, the Black Death's imprint remained, not as a source of despair, but as a reminder of resilience and renewal. The psychological imprint of the Black Death cannot be overstated. Generations lived in the shadow of catastrophe, which fostered a society simultaneously wary and ambitious. Europeans became more adaptable, more willing to challenge the old order, more open to experimentation in commerce, art, and science. This adaptability explains why Europe, unlike some other regions affected by plague, eventually recovered and flourished. The disaster forced innovation out of necessity and reshaped priorities in ways that would echo for centuries. And so, when we ask the question, how did the Black Death change Europe forever? The answer is multifaceted but clear. It transformed the continent socially, economically, culturally, and psychologically. It weakened rigid hierarchies, giving common people leverage and new freedoms. It shifted wealth and labor patterns, accelerating urbanization and trade. It challenged the authority of the church, fostering personal faith and eventually intellectual inquiry. It inspired art, literature, and scientific observation that celebrated the human experience and sought to understand the natural world. Every subsequent development in European society, from the Renaissance to the rise of nation-states, carried echoes of the mortality crisis that had swept the continent in the mid-14th century. In short, the Black Death was both an ending and a beginning. It ended a Europe rooted in medieval certainty, where hierarchy, tradition, and faith alone structured life. It began a Europe that questioned, innovated, and explored, a Europe in which human creativity and resilience became as central to history as kings and battles. By forcing the continent to confront death on an unprecedented scale, it forced Europeans to reconsider the value of life, the meaning of community, and the potential of human ingenuity. In that way, the Black Death did not merely shape history, it reshaped what it meant to live within history itself. Socially, the Black Death is transformative. The massive reduction in population creates labor shortages that empower surviving workers. Peasants and artisans can demand better wages, negotiate terms, and move to towns or estates that offer more favorable conditions. Lords and landowners, desperate to maintain production, are forced to make concessions previously unimaginable. In England, this tension culminates decades later in the peasants' revolt of 1381, while across the continent, similar shifts gradually weaken feudal hierarchies. Ordinary Europeans discover that survival carries not only the burden of grief, but also newfound leverage in a world where labor is scarce and life is precious. Economically, the ripple effects extend further. With fewer people to feed, per capita wealth rises. Fields are converted from grain to pasture. Livestock becomes more prominent. Trade adapts. Cities, once dependent on surrounding villages for food and labor, innovate to maintain commerce. Maritime republics like Genoa and Venice capitalize on this, investing in ships, trade networks, and banking systems that fuel long-term economic growth. The plague, horrific as it is, becomes a catalyst for adaptation, innovation, and long-term prosperity. Culturally, the Black Death reshapes Europe in ways that persist for centuries. Artists, writers, and musicians internalize the trauma and produce works reflecting human fragility and resilience. The dance macabre motif emerges in murals across France and Germany, portraying skeletons leading men and women of all social classes to the grave, a visual meditation on mortality. In literature, Boccaccio's Decameron captures the blend of humor, tragedy, and moral reflection that emerges from human experience under extreme duress. Music begins to explore more somber themes, reflecting a consciousness acutely aware of death's inevitability. Medical knowledge evolves too. Observers note patterns of transmission, the efficacy of isolation, and the value of documenting cases and deaths. Some cities institute primitive quarantines. Venice famously isolates arriving ships for 40 days, giving the term quarantine its origin. Clergy, often decimated themselves, leave records that provide insight into the spread and social impact of disease. These efforts, rudimentary as they are, mark the beginnings of public health awareness and scientific observation in Europe. By incorporating these layers, daily life, regional variation, social restructuring, economic change, cultural expression, and medical adaptation, we begin to see how the Black Death did not merely kill but transformed Europe on every level. It forced societies to adapt, question tradition, innovate, and reorganize. The continent that emerged was fundamentally different from the one that entered the mid-14th century, poised for Renaissance humanism, scientific exploration, and social mobility that would define the coming centuries. The people who survived the first waves of the plague often carried invisible scars alongside the visible ones. In towns where half the population had died, streets that were once crowded with merchants, children, and beggars became silent or half-empty. Doors were boarded up, shops closed indefinitely. Families that had once been large were reduced to one or two survivors, who inherited not only property but also the memories of grief and the responsibility of continuing life. Imagine a mother walking through a market square and seeing the empty windows of neighbors who had perished, or a craftsman entering his workshop only to find that half of his apprentices were gone, leaving him to manage the business alone. These were the small, intimate ways that the plague reshaped daily life, instilling a heightened awareness of mortality that would influence thought, behavior, and culture for generations. In rural areas, the impact was equally profound. Fields that once teemed with workers went untended, and forests slowly reclaimed abandoned farmland. Villages that had existed for centuries disappeared entirely, leaving only stones and overgrown paths to mark where people had once lived. The survivors learned to adapt. Some families consolidated farms, combining the land of the deceased with their own. Others moved to towns seeking work and community. This migration contributed to urban growth and changed the demographics of cities, concentrating populations in ways that would alter trade, governance, and social interaction. Economically, labor scarcity became a defining factor. Peasants who survived the plague realized that their work was now in high demand. Landowners, desperate to maintain production, were forced to offer higher wages, better working conditions, and in some cases, freedoms that had been unthinkable before. This shift weakened the rigid feudal system that had dominated Europe for centuries. Laborers were no longer bound solely by tradition. They could negotiate, relocate, or even revolt if they felt exploited. This newfound leverage fundamentally changed the relationship between rulers and the ruled, creating a more fluid social hierarchy that allowed for mobility and opportunity. The economic consequences of this were vast. Towns grew wealthier, trade expanded, and markets became more dynamic. In England, this change eventually contributed to the peasants' revolt of 1381, a clear demonstration that the Black Death had permanently altered the balance of power in society. The psychological effects of the plague were also profound. For those who lived through it, fear of sudden death became a constant companion. At the same time, having witnessed so much loss, many survivors developed a deeper appreciation for life's fleeting moments. Families celebrated births with more joy, communities marked festivals with renewed intensity, and individuals sought meaning in both work and leisure. This heightened awareness of mortality also influenced the arts. Artists began portraying life and death together, celebrating human beauty while acknowledging its fragility. Painters and sculptors experimented with realism, proportion, and perspective, often emphasizing the human form and emotion. Literature explored morality, survival, and human behavior under stress, with stories oscillating between humor, tragedy, and wisdom. Music became more reflective, incorporating somber tones and themes of remembrance. In this sense, the Black Death reshaped Europe not only physically and economically, but emotionally and spiritually, leaving a legacy that would resonate through generations. Cultural shifts extended beyond artistic expression. Religion, while remaining central, began to evolve. The church had been unable to prevent or cure the plague, and its authority was challenged. Some people doubled down on piety, joining processions or participating in flagellant movements as acts of devotion or penance. Others questioned the church's power and interpretation of divine will. Personal spirituality grew in importance, as individuals sought to understand the divine on their own terms. This slow, subtle transformation planted the seeds for later reform movements and reshaped how European societies related to faith, morality, and the concept of salvation. The plague also influenced education and intellectual curiosity. Survivors and their descendants sought to understand the causes of the disease, the patterns of infection, and the failures of traditional medicine. Universities and scholars began questioning inherited knowledge, exploring empirical observation, and documenting cases. Quarantine measures, port inspections, and record-keeping laid the early groundwork for public health systems and epidemiology. People realized that knowledge and careful observation could mitigate risk and save lives, fostering a mindset that would eventually contribute to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Urban life, too, transformed in response to the plague. Cities rebuilt streets, improved sanitation, and restructured markets to accommodate a reduced but more concentrated population. Guilds reformed, and apprenticeships became more flexible as master craftsmen adapted to labor shortages. Wealth that had been concentrated in the hands of deceased nobles was redistributed, fueling commerce and innovation. Venice, Florence, and other maritime cities leveraged this moment to strengthen trade networks, invest in shipping, and enhance infrastructure, positioning themselves as hubs of culture and commerce for the coming centuries. The Black Death also influenced Europe's political trajectory. Monarchs and city-states, confronted with depopulated lands and weakened institutions, adapted governance strategies to maintain order. They implemented taxation policies to support rebuilding, encouraged migration to repopulate towns, and negotiated labor agreements with the surviving workforce. These adjustments strengthened the capacity of governments to respond to crisis, laying the groundwork for modern state administration. In effect, the plague forced rulers to consider the practical needs of the population, demonstrating that political stability depended on the welfare of ordinary citizens. In reflecting on the question, how did the Black Death change Europe forever? The evidence becomes clear. The pandemic did more than kill. It restructured society on multiple levels. It reshaped demographics, empowering laborers and redistributing wealth. It transformed culture, inspiring new forms of art, literature, and music that reflected mortality and human resilience. It challenged religious authority, fostering personal devotion and questioning institutional power. It spurred intellectual curiosity, laying the foundations for scientific inquiry and public health practices. And it altered political structures, strengthening governance by forcing rulers to adapt to a dramatically changed world. Across every domain, social, economic, cultural, intellectual, and political. The Black Death forced Europe to confront mortality, to innovate, and to rebuild differently. Across Europe, the human experience of the Black Death was as varied as the landscapes themselves. In the bustling cities of Italy, survivors told stories of neighbors disappearing overnight, entire families succumbing within weeks. Florence, a city of merchants, artisans, and bankers, witnessed its streets grow eerily quiet, shops shuttered, and markets abandoned. Chroniclers of the time, like Giovanni Villani, recorded the sense of confusion and helplessness that pervaded the city. Families fled to the countryside, hopping to escape the plague's reach, only to find that no place was truly safe. In villages, the impact was more intimate but no less devastating. Cottages were emptied, livestock wandered untended, and children often buried parents, left to fend for themselves at ages barely beyond infancy. Survivors carried these experiences with them, shaping not only how they lived but how they thought. Many developed a heightened sense of precaution. Villages implemented local quarantines, neighbors watched over the sick, and communal care became a necessity. At the same time, the awareness of life's fragility fostered a quiet determination to cherish each day. Weddings, births, and harvest festivals were celebrated with renewed vigor, while mourning became a deeply communal experience. The psychological imprint of the plague, fear, grief, and resilience, created a Europe that was profoundly more conscious of mortality than any previous generation. Regional differences further influenced recovery and adaptation. In England, the plague spread through ports along the south coast and moved inland via trade routes. Mortality estimates range from 1/3 to over 1/2 of the population in some towns. The resulting labor shortages allowed peasants to negotiate better wages and challenge traditional obligations to landlords. Laws such as the Statute of Laborers attempted to freeze wages, but enforcement was uneven and mobility increased. In France, cities along the Loire and Seine experienced similar devastation, though the feudal structure remained more entrenched, requiring decades of adjustment. Italy, particularly its port cities, faced repeated outbreaks but also benefited from a wealthier, more urbanized population, which allowed for faster economic recovery and the patronage of the arts. In Germany and Scandinavia, the impact was less concentrated in urban centers but still significant, as small towns and rural areas struggled with depopulation, labor shortages, and the breakdown of traditional social networks. Economically, the plague forced innovation. With fewer hands to work the land, agricultural practices changed. Grain fields were converted to pasture for livestock, vineyards expanded, and labor-saving tools became more valuable. In cities, artisans and craftsmen reorganized their workshops, often taking on apprentices at higher wages than before. Trade networks adapted. Venice invested in more efficient shipping and expanded its connections to the Eastern Mediterranean. The Hanseatic League in Northern Europe solidified its control over trade routes connecting the Baltic and North Seas. Even in local markets, the scarcity of workers meant that surviving laborers could demand higher pay, negotiate better conditions, and choose their employers, an unprecedented shift in social and economic power. Cultural consequences were equally profound. Art reflected both trauma and hope. Painters began to explore human emotion in greater depth, portraying grief, fear, and compassion alongside scenes of everyday life. Sculptors emphasized realism, anatomy, and movement, celebrating the human form even as it was marked by mortality. Literature, too, engaged directly with themes of survival, ethics, and human behavior under extreme stress. Boccaccio's Decameron, for instance, framed storytelling as both escape and reflection, revealing the ingenuity and resilience of people in times of crisis. Music and performance also evolved. Funeral laments, processional hymns, and festival songs alike reflected a society grappling with death yet determined to affirm life. Religious life was reshaped as well. Many believed the plague was divine punishment, prompting acts of penance, pilgrimages, and processions. Others, however, questioned the church's authority, recognizing that even the clergy were not immune. This skepticism contributed to the intellectual climate that would later support reform movements, laying the foundation for the Reformation. Personal devotion became more common, emphasizing individual responsibility, prayer, and moral reflection. In effect, the Black Death changed how Europeans understood faith, not simply as obedience to authority, but as a personal, reflective practice. Science and medicine also advanced, albeit slowly. Physicians and local authorities observed patterns of contagion, isolation, and survival. Cities like Venice instituted quarantines, while records of deaths and illness became more systematic. Although medieval medical theory remained limited, the experience encouraged observation, documentation, and experimentation, practices that would later inform Renaissance medicine and the scientific revolution. The recognition that careful observation could save lives was an indirect but profound legacy of the plague. Politically, the impact was equally transformative. Governments faced depopulated territories and weakened institutions, prompting them to reorganize administration, taxation, and labor management. Monarchs and city-states realized that social stability required attention to the welfare of ordinary citizens, not just the nobility. The redistribution of labor and wealth destabilized long-standing hierarchies, creating opportunities for mobility and social change. These shifts contributed to the gradual decline of feudalism and the emergence of more centralized, bureaucratic forms of governance. In reflecting on the broader question of the title, how did the Black Death change Europe forever? We see the answer emerge across multiple dimensions. Demographically, it created scarcity that empowered survivors. Economically, it prompted innovation, redistributed wealth, and transformed labor markets. Socially, it altered class structures, family dynamics, and community organization. Culturally, it reshaped art, literature, music, and personal expression. Spiritually, it challenged established authority and encouraged introspection. Politically, it strengthened administrative structures and prompted adaptation. And psychologically, it instilled a heightened awareness of life, mortality, and human potential. The Black Death, in short, was not merely a crisis to endure. It was a catalyst that redefined nearly every aspect of European life. Urvavar stories from across Europe reveal both the horror and the resilience of the people who lived through the Black Death. In small villages in northern France, families reported hiding in forest clearings, bringing with them only what they could carry. Children clung to their parents as they watched neighbors fall ill one by one, their cries echoing through the woods at night. In England, some chronicles tell of entire hamlets where not a single adult survived, leaving orphans to navigate a world they had no hope of fully understanding. Yet even amid despair, humans adapted. Families consolidated properties, established new household routines, and found ways to preserve community memory. Stories of courage, such as local healers nursing the sick with limited supplies or merchants providing food to quarantined neighbors, became legends, passed down for generations as testimony to human endurance. In urban centers, the devastation forced a reconsideration of infrastructure and public space. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris had to rebuild streets, markets, and public buildings with a reduced workforce. Merchants invested in warehouses and docks to handle trade more efficiently, while governments imposed regulations to prevent further outbreaks, such as restricting waste disposal in crowded streets and instituting early forms of sanitation oversight. Apprenticeships and guild systems were reorganized to maintain skilled labor, and surviving artisans often rose to prominence simply because they had survived where others had perished. The economic and social vacuum created by the plague accelerated mobility, innovation, and the circulation of ideas in ways that would have been impossible in a fully populated medieval Europe. Trade networks, which had been disrupted by the initial waves of the plague, slowly recovered but with profound changes. The Mediterranean ports, particularly Venice and Genoa, became more cautious but also more strategic, investing in fleets capable of rapid transport and reliable trade. Northern Europe's Hanseatic League strengthened its control over Baltic and North Sea routes, ensuring the flow of timber, grain, and cloth. Merchants became increasingly savvy, documenting cargo, tracking arrivals and departures, and even beginning to use early forms of accounting that allowed them to manage risk in a world suddenly more unpredictable. This increased efficiency in commerce laid the groundwork for the financial and economic sophistication that fueled the Renaissance. Culturally, the trauma of the plague inspired a profound humanism in art, literature, and philosophy. Painters explored not only religious subjects, but the emotional lives of ordinary people. Frescoes and altarpieces began to reflect grief, compassion, and resilience, portraying figures whose expressions communicated both sorrow and hope. Sculptors emphasized naturalism and movement, studying the human body to capture its beauty and vulnerability. Writers, inspired by the extremes of human experience, produced stories that explored morality, ingenuity, and survival under extraordinary conditions. Philosophers began to question inherited wisdom, pondering the nature of life, the role of fate, and humanity's capacity to endure suffering. In every domain of culture, the Black Death left an imprint, creating a Europe more attuned to human experience and the fragility of existence. Religion, while still central, evolved as well. The Church's inability to prevent or cure the plague prompted both skepticism and introspection. Some turned to extreme piety, joining processions or engaging in acts of penance, while others embraced personal devotion and spiritual reflection. The widespread questioning of religious authority, combined with increased literacy and the circulation of ideas, set the stage for later reform movements, including the Protestant Reformation. The psychological legacy of the plague, awareness of mortality and the unpredictability of life, shaped European spirituality, creating a more personal, reflective, and in some cases, secular approach to meaning and morality. The demographic collapse also had profound political consequences. Monarchs and city-states were forced to govern populations that had shrunk dramatically, which required innovation in administration, taxation, and social management. In some regions, the redistribution of land and wealth led to tension and even rebellion, as peasants asserted new rights and opportunities. In others, rulers consolidated authority, using bureaucracy and law to stabilize society. These shifts contributed to the gradual decline of feudalism and the emergence of stronger, more centralized forms of government, laying the groundwork for modern state systems. Education and knowledge were transformed as well. Universities that survived the plague began emphasizing empirical observation alongside traditional study. Physicians documented symptoms, mortality, and treatment attempts, contributing to the slow evolution of medical science. Scholars questioned classical authorities and began to explore natural philosophy with renewed curiosity. The awareness that observation and knowledge could prevent or mitigate disaster planted seeds for scientific inquiry and rational analysis that would flourish in the Renaissance and beyond. By reflecting on these combined effects, the answer to the question, how did the Black Death change Europe forever, becomes unmistakably clear. The pandemic reshaped the continent across every axis of society. Demographically, it altered populations, empowering labor and redistributing wealth. Economically, it prompted innovation, restructured trade, and fostered urban growth. Culturally, it inspired art, literature, and philosophy that emphasized human experience, resilience, and mortality. Spiritually, it challenged institutions, encouraged introspection, and fostered personal devotion. Politically, it strengthened governance, centralized authority, and created more adaptive states. Psychologically, it forced Europe to confront fragility and uncertainty, cultivating awareness, empathy, and innovation. The Black Death, in short, was not merely a tragedy. It was a catalyst for transformation, setting the stage for the Renaissance, exploration, and the modern era. In the decades after the plague, Europe's survivors began to rebuild, not just physically but intellectually, culturally, and socially. The devastation had forced people to confront mortality in ways that left a lasting impression on their mindset. This confrontation sparked a curiosity about life, the world, and human potential that had previously been constrained by tradition, fear, and religious authority. In Italy, cities like Florence became crucibles of innovation, fueled by wealth redistributed from the catastrophic loss of life. The Medici family, for example, rose to prominence in part because they were able to consolidate resources and patronage that had once been divided among many more households. With new wealth came investment in art, architecture, education, and scholarship, a deliberate effort to celebrate human achievement and leave something enduring in the wake of catastrophe. The Renaissance, in many ways, was a direct response to the psychological and cultural aftershocks of the Black Death. Artists like Giotto, Masaccio, and later Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo explored human anatomy, emotion, and proportion with a depth previously unseen. Literature, from Petrarch's humanist poetry to Boccaccio's storytelling, emphasized the dignity of human experience, the fleeting nature of life, and the power of individual thought. Scholars revisited classical texts, not simply as authority to be accepted, but as sources of insight to be tested, debated, and understood. In philosophy, thinkers began to question the nature of knowledge, morality, and governance, questions that arose in part because society had been forced to survive chaos and uncertainty. The trauma of the plague had made people acutely aware that life could vanish at any moment, inspiring a culture that prized observation, innovation, and expression. Exploration, too, owes part of its momentum to the societal shifts induced by the plague. Population loss meant that labor and resources were reallocated. Merchants and nobles sought new opportunities beyond Europe's borders. Wealth concentrated in the hands of survivors allowed for investment in ships, trade expeditions, and overseas colonies. Italian city-states, with their maritime traditions, became centers for navigation and commerce. Portugal and Spain, rising from relative peripheral positions, began sponsoring voyages of discovery, motivated by economic ambition, religious zeal, and the curiosity sparked in a continent newly attuned to uncertainty and opportunity. The Black Death, by changing the balance of labor, wealth, and risk tolerance, indirectly created the conditions for Europe's age of global exploration. The political consequences of the plague were equally significant. Monarchs who had survived multiple outbreaks learned that governance required flexibility and attention to the needs of the population. Labor shortages and social unrest forced reforms in taxation, law, and labor policy. Feudal obligations weakened, and cities gained autonomy. Centralized states emerged more capable of coordinated action, from managing trade to raising armies. In England, France, Spain, and the Italian city-states, governments became more bureaucratically sophisticated, capable of sustaining complex economic and social systems. The Black Death, then, was not merely a demographic catastrophe. It was a catalyst for stronger, more adaptive political institutions that could manage a changing society. Even environmental and demographic changes had long-term effects. Fewer people meant less pressure on farmland, allowing forests to reclaim marginal areas, improving soil quality, and altering local climates slightly. Food became more abundant for survivors, contributing to better health and higher standards of living. Population density shifted, fostering urban growth and the concentration of talent, innovation, and ideas in cities that would later become centers of science, art, and commerce. The plague reshaped not only human society, but the environment in ways that would influence agriculture, settlement patterns, and economic development for centuries. Culturally, the Black Death continued to inform artistic expression and thought long after the last outbreaks. The themes of mortality, human frailty, and resilience pervaded painting, sculpture, literature, and music. Dance of death imagery, funerary art, and literature exploring survival, morality, and human folly reminded people of life's fragility while encouraging them to celebrate its beauty. The existential awareness that the plague instilled became a defining feature of European consciousness, shaping not only how people lived, but how they imagined life, death, and the future. In analyzing the question, how did the Black Death change Europe forever? It becomes evident that its impact was profound and multidimensional. It forced a reconsideration of social structures, empowered labor, and redistributed wealth. It transformed cultural expression, inspiring art, literature, and humanist thought that celebrated life and emphasized observation and reason. It reshaped religious practice, encouraging personal devotion and questioning institutional authority. It prompted political adaptation, strengthening governance and administrative capacity. It influenced economics, trade, and urban development, laying the foundations for modern markets and exploration. And psychologically, it instilled an acute awareness of mortality, prompting resilience, reflection, and ambition. In short, the Black Death was not just a moment of death. It was a moment of transformation, a pivot upon which the trajectory of Europe turned toward modernity. Even centuries later, the echoes of the Black Death can be traced in European institutions, culture, and thought. The cities rebuilt from its devastation became centers of trade and learning. The artistic and literary movements it inspired continued to shape European consciousness. The intellectual curiosity it fostered contributed to scientific discoveries and philosophical debates that defined the Renaissance and early modern Europe. By forcing humanity to confront mortality, the plague accelerated the evolution of society in every domain, leaving a legacy that would shape Europe forever. The demographic and social upheaval caused by the Black Death did not simply vanish after the initial waves of mortality. It reverberated through Europe for generations, shaping the ambitions, fears, and innovations of entire societies. By the late 15th century, a Europe that had been hollowed out by plague was beginning to assert itself on the world stage. Its people had survived calamity, learned the value of adaptation, and gained a sense of agency that would fuel the great voyages of discovery. Mariners from Portugal, Spain, and Italy did not sail into the unknown blindly. They were part of a society that had, in the aftermath of tragedy, become acutely aware that life was fragile and opportunity fleeting. To venture across uncharted seas was, in a sense, a continuation of the resilience and daring that had been honed during decades of plague recovery. In Portugal, Prince Henry the Navigator invested heavily in shipbuilding and navigation along the western coast of Africa. These expeditions, undertaken in a Europe still recovering from labor shortages and social upheaval, required enormous resources made possible by wealth concentrated in the hands of survivors and by new economic systems forged after the plague. The scarcity of labor and the rise of urban commerce encouraged investment in trade ventures that promised high returns. Similarly, Spain, unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, sponsored voyages to the New World, most famously Columbus in 1492. The courage to invest in exploration, to risk ships and lives on the possibility of discovery, can be traced to the psychological and economic shifts wrought by the Black Death. In a continent that had seen death sweep through cities and fields, risk and reward were inseparably linked, and the survivors were willing to seize opportunities that earlier generations might have avoided. The spread of knowledge, literacy, and humanist thought after the plague also played a critical role. Universities, which had survived but adapted, emphasized study, observation, and critical inquiry. Survivors and their descendants sought to understand the world beyond immediate necessity, questioning traditional authority and seeking empirical knowledge. Maps were drawn with unprecedented accuracy, astronomical charts refined, and medical observations recorded with meticulous care. In short, a society traumatized by mortality also became a society of inquiry, calculation, and careful planning. The Renaissance, the flowering of art, science, and humanism, was inseparable from the experience of surviving catastrophe. Europe's newfound curiosity and ambition, born of the Black Death, propelled it toward exploration, colonization, and the transformation of global networks. Religion, too, continued to evolve in this post-plague Europe. The Church had been unable to prevent or cure the Black Death, and the spiritual crisis it created had far-reaching consequences. Some Europeans intensified devotion, but many began to question clerical authority and the efficacy of traditional practices. This intellectual and spiritual ferment contributed to the conditions that enabled the Reformation in the 16th century. Figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin emerged in a world already questioning hierarchy, authority, and tradition, a Europe that had survived catastrophe and demanded both accountability and understanding. In this sense, the Black Death was a seed of change, altering not only the physical and economic structures of society, but also its spiritual and ideological landscape. Political structures, weakened by the demographic collapse, also transformed. Monarchs and city-states that survived the plague implemented new forms of administration and governance. Bureaucracies expanded, tax systems were revised, and labor laws adapted to the new realities of scarcity. The redistribution of power and wealth accelerated the decline of feudalism, strengthened urban centers, and allowed centralized states to emerge with more robust authority. In England, France, and Spain, rulers began to understand that maintaining order required attention to the welfare of common people, trade networks, and urban infrastructure. A government that ignored these factors risked instability or rebellion, a lesson painfully reinforced by the social upheavals following the plague. At the same time, the Black Death's legacy continued to shape culture and intellectual life. Artists and writers repeatedly explored the theme of mortality, producing works that reflected both the trauma of loss and the beauty of human resilience. The danse macabre motif, which depicted death leading individuals from every class to the grave, became a central artistic theme across Europe. Literature explored survival, morality, and human ingenuity. Music, too, carried the imprint of collective grief and resilience, with laments, hymns, and festival music balancing sorrow and celebration. The psychological impact of the plague, the awareness of fragility and impermanence, had become woven into the very fabric of European culture. Economically, the effects of the Black Death continued to resonate into the 16th century and beyond. Labor shortages incentivized technological innovation in agriculture and industry. Fewer people meant greater access to land, which raised per capita wealth and improved nutrition. Urban centers became more efficient and prosperous, supported by trade networks strengthened by survivors who understood risk, opportunity, and the importance of planning. These economic foundations, laid in the shadow of catastrophe, enabled Europe to fund exploration, establish colonies overseas, and expand its influence on a global scale. When we reflect on the question, how did the Black Death change Europe forever? The answer is now unmistakable. The plague reshaped European society at every level, socially, economically, culturally, politically, and psychologically. It empowered survivors, redistributed wealth, accelerated urbanization, and weakened rigid hierarchies. It inspired art, literature, music, and philosophical thought that emphasized human experience and resilience. It challenged religious authority and fostered personal devotion and inquiry. It encouraged exploration, trade, and the expansion of European influence worldwide. Most importantly, it reshaped the European mindset, instilling awareness of mortality, resilience in the face of catastrophe, and a willingness to innovate. In essence, the Black Death created a Europe that was fundamentally different, a Europe capable of transformation, of imagining new possibilities, and of leaving an enduring mark on history. Across Europe, the human stories of survival and adaptation are as diverse as the regions themselves. In northern Italy, towns like Siena and Florence recorded staggering death tolls, yet survivors rebuilt their homes, workshops, and communities with remarkable ingenuity. Merchants returned to the markets, artisans reopened workshops, and scholars resumed study in university halls that had once been deserted. Chroniclers wrote about parents burying children, spouses losing partners, and communities mourning entire generations, yet also about neighbors caring for one another, sharing scarce food, and nursing the sick. These intimate accounts reveal a paradox of the Black Death: immense loss accompanied by the emergence of resilience, compassion, and innovation. In England, villages along the Thames and Severn rivers bore similar devastation. Entire villages vanished, leaving behind abandoned cottages and overgrown fields. Survivors were forced to negotiate labor agreements with landowners in ways previously unimaginable. Laborers could demand wages that reflected their scarcity. Serfs gained leverage to negotiate freedom from certain feudal obligations. The social and economic shifts were revolutionary, contributing to the eventual weakening of feudal hierarchies and enabling new forms of social mobility. Communities adapted by consolidating farms, pooling resources, and reorganizing local governance to maintain survival and continuity. France experienced both urban and rural upheaval. Cities such as Paris and Lyon faced repeated outbreaks, while the countryside suffered depopulation and abandoned villages. Survivors were often left to reorganize markets, maintain trade routes, and tend fields with fewer hands. Yet this scarcity created opportunities. Surviving laborers could claim land or demand wages, towns grew more autonomous, and economic activity gradually shifted to accommodate the new reality. In regions like Provence and Burgundy, trade hubs consolidated wealth, setting the stage for the later prosperity that fueled the French Renaissance. Even in Northern Europe and Scandinavia, where population density was lower, the impact of the Black Death was profound. Small towns and rural settlements experienced mortality rates as high as 50%. Social networks were disrupted, religious institutions lost clergy, and local governance struggled to maintain order. Yet these challenges forced communities to innovate. Local leaders developed rudimentary public health measures, communities instituted quarantines, and trade networks adapted to account for workforce shortages. The shared trauma of the plague, combined with practical adaptation, reshaped the collective consciousness, instilling resilience, pragmatism, and a willingness to challenge traditional hierarchies. Economically, the Black Death was transformative on a continental scale. Labor scarcity forced innovations in agriculture. Fields were converted from grain to pasture, vineyards expanded, and livestock became a more prominent source of wealth. Urban economies adapted as well. Artisans took on apprentices at higher wages, guilds restructured, and merchants invested in more efficient trade practices. Venice and Genoa expanded their maritime trade networks, while the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe consolidated control over the Baltic and North Sea routes. The redistribution of wealth, combined with increased per capita resources, enabled survivors to fund education, invest in commerce, and patronize the arts, laying the foundation for the Renaissance. Cultural shifts after the Black Death were profound. Artists began exploring realism and human emotion with unprecedented depth. Frescoes, altarpieces, and sculptures depicted grief, compassion, and mortality alongside religious and secular subjects. Literature, from Boccaccio's Decameron to later chronicles and philosophical writings, examined survival, morality, and human ingenuity. Music evolved to reflect both loss and resilience, with laments, hymns, and festival songs balancing sorrow and celebration. Even daily rituals were influenced. Festivals, religious observances, and communal gatherings increasingly emphasized both remembrance and the affirmation of life. Europe became a continent more conscious of mortality, more reflective of human experience, and more attuned to the fragility and value of existence. Religious practice evolved in tandem. The Church had been unable to prevent or cure the Black Death, prompting many to question clerical authority. While some sought solace in extreme acts of devotion, others embraced personal prayer, reflection, and a more individualized spirituality. The intellectual and spiritual ferment of post-plague Europe contributed to the Reformation, which challenged institutional authority, emphasized personal conscience, and redefined the relationship between humanity and faith. In this sense, the Black Death was not only a demographic and economic turning point, but also an ideological one, reshaping the very principles of belief and practice across the continent. Science and medicine, though still limited by contemporary knowledge, advanced through observation and documentation. Physicians began noting patterns of contagion, documenting symptoms, and recording mortality rates. Cities experimented with quarantine, isolation, and sanitation measures. Clerical and civic records preserved knowledge that would later inform public health systems and epidemiology. The plague taught Europe that knowledge, observation, and preparation could mitigate disaster, sowing the seeds of empirical study that would blossom during the Renaissance and scientific revolution. Politically, the Black Death accelerated the decline of feudalism and strengthened emerging centralized states. Monarchs and city-states adapted to depopulated territories, reorganizing taxation, labor systems, and local administration. Urban centers gained autonomy, and governance increasingly depended on practical management rather than inherited authority. England, France, and the Italian city-states became more bureaucratically sophisticated, capable of maintaining order and fostering trade, infrastructure, and cultural development. The lessons of the plague, fragility, adaptation, and resilience, shaped the political landscape for centuries. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Europe's post-plague transformations enabled the flowering of humanism, the Renaissance, and global exploration. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome became centers of art, scholarship, and commerce. Merchants and nobles who survived the plague invested in education, patronage, and innovation. Artists studied human anatomy, perspective, and emotion, producing works that celebrated both beauty and mortality. Scholars questioned inherited authority, experimented with observation, and embraced critical thinking, laying the foundation for scientific inquiry. Explorers ventured across oceans, motivated by curiosity, ambition, and the economic resources made available through the post-plague restructuring of society. All of this points back to the central question: how did the Black Death change Europe forever? The answer is both direct and profound. The pandemic reshaped populations, empowered survivors, and redistributed wealth. It forced economic innovation, urban reconstruction, and trade adaptation. It inspired cultural and artistic transformation that emphasized human experience and mortality. It challenged religious authority, fostered individual spirituality, and encouraged intellectual inquiry. It strengthened political institutions, centralized governance, and accelerated the decline of feudalism. Psychologically, it instilled an awareness of fragility, risk, and opportunity that would influence behavior, ambition, and innovation for generations. The Black Death was a crucible of transformation, a tragedy that destroyed countless lives but simultaneously catalyzed the emergence of a Europe that was resilient, inquisitive, and profoundly changed in every aspect of society. Even decades after the Black Death, Europe was still recovering, yet the transformation was undeniable. In northern Italy, cities like Venice, Florence, and Milan became epicenters of commerce, culture, and learning. Venice, with its intricate canals and thriving merchant class, invested in shipping, port infrastructure, and banking systems that allowed it to dominate Mediterranean trade. Florence, under the patronage of families like the Medici, saw art, architecture, and scholarship flourish. Painters studied human anatomy, perspective, and emotion. Sculptors explored movement and realism, and writers explored morality, human behavior, and the fragility of life. The concentrated wealth and social restructuring following the plague allowed these cities to become laboratories of cultural and intellectual innovation. In England, rural areas faced a different set of challenges and opportunities. Depopulated villages left laborers with unprecedented bargaining power. Peasants could demand higher wages, challenge traditional obligations, and in some cases, acquire land they had previously been denied. This shift weakened the rigid feudal system and increased social mobility, laying the groundwork for a society more flexible and adaptive than the one that had existed before the plague. Urban centers such as London and York rebuilt markets, streets, and infrastructure, integrating new labor practices and trade patterns. The economy gradually recovered, and merchants who had survived the plague were able to consolidate wealth and influence, contributing to England's later economic expansion. France's experience was marked by both devastation and resilience. Cities along the Seine and Loire struggled with repeated outbreaks, while rural areas faced depopulation. Survivors adapted by consolidating farms, reorganizing communities, and finding ways to sustain trade and production. Over time, urban centers gained prominence as regional hubs of commerce, governance, and culture. The redistribution of labor and wealth allowed for increased mobility and social negotiation, echoing the changes seen across the continent. By the late 15th century, France was emerging as a society ready to invest in art, education, and political centralization, demonstrating that the long-term consequences of the plague extended far beyond the immediate mortality it caused. Northern Europe and Scandinavia faced similar challenges. Towns in the Hanseatic League, such as Lübeck and Hamburg, adapted by strengthening trade networks and regulating markets. Urban centers focused on public infrastructure, sanitation, and workforce management to mitigate future outbreaks. Rural areas, though less densely populated, implemented local governance and community organization to maintain continuity. Across these regions, the Black Death accelerated social and economic adaptation, producing communities capable of innovation and resilience in the face of ongoing uncertainty. Cultural impacts of the plague continued to resonate for centuries. In art, literature, and music, the themes of mortality, resilience, and human experience became central. The dance macabre motif, which depicted death leading men and women from all social classes to the grave, symbolized both shared human vulnerability and the universality of experience. Writers explored morality, ingenuity, and survival, reflecting on the profound lessons learned from mass mortality. Musicians composed laments, hymns, and festival music that balanced grief with celebration, creating a cultural landscape that recognized death while affirming life. Across every artistic medium, the psychological imprint of the Black Death shaped European consciousness, influencing how people lived, created, and thought for generations. Religion, too, evolved in response to the plague. The Church's inability to prevent or mitigate the disaster led to questioning of authority, while personal devotion, introspection, and localized religious practice became more common. Pilgrimages, processions, and acts of penance continued, but they were supplemented by private prayer, reflection, and moral contemplation. The spiritual transformation set the stage for the Reformation, which would further challenge hierarchical authority, emphasize individual conscience, and redefine the relationship between humanity and divinity. In this way, the Black Death shaped not only immediate practices of faith, but the trajectory of European religious thought for centuries. Economically, the Black Death had lasting effects on production, trade, and social mobility. Fewer people meant that survivors had more access to land, resources, and wealth. Labor shortages incentivized technological innovation in agriculture and crafts, while urban centers adapted guild structures, apprenticeships, and trade regulations to meet changing workforce conditions. Merchants invested in maritime trade, banking, and infrastructure, creating a foundation for European economic expansion. These economic adaptations fueled exploration, investment in education, and the patronage of art and science, demonstrating how a demographic crisis reshaped the financial and social systems of the continent. Politically, Europe emerged with more sophisticated governance. Monarchs, city-states and regional authorities implemented bureaucratic reforms, reorganized taxation, and adapted labor laws to the new demographic reality. The redistribution of population and wealth strengthened centralized authority while promoting social negotiation. The decline of feudal obligations allowed for more mobility and participation by urban and rural populations, creating the conditions for modern state structures. Across England, France, Spain, and the Italian city-states, political adaptation in response to the Black Death established patterns of governance that would influence European society for centuries. Exploration and global expansion, while distant from the immediate devastation, were direct consequences of the transformations wrought by the plague. Wealth concentrated among survivors enabled investment in ships, crews, and navigation. Intellectual curiosity, heightened awareness of risk, and the ambition born from surviving catastrophe encouraged Europeans to venture across oceans. Portugal, Spain, and later, the Dutch and English empires embarked on voyages of discovery, colonization, and trade, establishing networks that would connect Europe to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The Black Death, by restructuring society, economy, and psychology, indirectly fueled Europe's emergence as a global power. As we reflect fully on the central question, how did the Black Death change Europe forever? Its answer is clear, multifaceted, and enduring. The pandemic reshaped demographics, redistributing population and empowering survivors. It transformed economies, incentivizing innovation, trade expansion, and wealth consolidation. Social structures were altered, weakening feudal hierarchies and increasing mobility. Cultural and artistic expression evolved, reflecting mortality, resilience, and human experience. Religious authority was questioned, encouraging personal devotion and intellectual reflection. Political institutions adapted, becoming more sophisticated, centralized, and capable of responding to crisis. Finally, Europe's collective psychology was forever altered. People became acutely aware of life's fragility, the necessity of adaptation, and the possibilities inherent in resilience. Across every aspect of society, the Black Death left an imprint that would define European history for centuries, making it not merely a disaster to endure, but a transformative force that reshaped the continent forever. The Black Death did not simply change Europe on the surface. It infiltrated the very rhythm of everyday life, altering the patterns of work, community, and thought. Imagine walking through a village in the spring of 1350. The fields are overgrown because families lost so many hands that harvests cannot be fully gathered. A mother gathers her few surviving children around a dwindling hearth, fearful that her neighbor, once a trusted friend, might not survive another week. Yet there is also cautious hope. The scarcity of labor has given her family leverage they never had before. Her surviving children are valued workers, not merely heirs to feudal obligations. The dynamics of survival, mortality, and social negotiation have already transformed ordinary life in ways unimaginable to someone from a century before. In cities, the story is no less dramatic. Merchants who once relied on a dozen clerks now manage with a skeleton staff, and yet trade does not stop. Venice, Florence, and Genoa, despite repeated outbreaks, rebuild canals, warehouses, and marketplaces. Apprentices who survive take on greater responsibilities, becoming the new masters of their trades. Guilds restructure to accommodate the loss of skilled artisans, and innovation accelerates out of necessity. These adaptations do more than preserve economic activity. They create a society more flexible, more capable of innovation, and more aware of human potential in the face of catastrophe. In this way, the plague reshaped the labor market, urban structure, and economic power, forever altering the social fabric of Europe. Cultural and psychological impacts were equally transformative. The survivors of the Black Death carried with them an acute awareness of mortality, which permeated art, literature, music, and daily ritual. Families and communities that endured mass death often turned to both artistic and spiritual expression as a way to process grief. Frescoes and illuminated manuscripts depict scenes of the dead alongside the living, emphasizing the fleeting nature of life and the importance of virtue, compassion, and resilience. Writers explored the fragility of human existence, the moral challenges of survival, and the ingenuity required to endure catastrophe. Music, in homes and churches, reflected both mourning and celebration, teaching future generations that life, though fragile, is precious. The plague instilled in Europe a consciousness that was simultaneously somber and creative, a consciousness that would underpin the flourishing of the Renaissance. Religious life was irrevocably altered. While some turned to extreme devotion, others questioned the Church's ability to provide protection or explanation. Pilgrimages, processions, and acts of penance were common, but they were supplemented by personal prayer, reflection, and ethical consideration. This growing emphasis on individual spirituality, prompted by widespread mortality and the inadequacy of institutional response, foreshadowed intellectual and spiritual movements such as the Reformation. Europe's survivors learned that authority was fallible, that life was uncertain, and that human action mattered in ways previously unconsidered. Economically, the Black Death's long-term effects were revolutionary. Scarcity of labor gave surviving workers leverage, encouraging mobility and better compensation. Land became available for purchase or cultivation, increasing wealth for those who could access it. Cities became hubs of concentrated talent and capital, allowing trade and banking to expand. Merchants invested in ships, infrastructure, and overseas trade, laying the groundwork for the age of exploration. Agricultural practices changed as well. Land use shifted toward livestock and pasture, vineyards expanded, and tools that increased efficiency were introduced. The pandemic, by reducing population and forcing adaptation, accelerated economic evolution in ways that shaped European prosperity for centuries. Even politically, the consequences were enduring. Monarchs and city-states learned that authority depended on effective management and adaptability. Labor shortages forced revisions in taxation, feudal obligations, and labor laws. Urban centers gained autonomy, contributing to more sophisticated governance. Over time, centralized states emerged that were capable of responding to social, economic, and demographic change, an essential foundation for the modern state. Without the societal disruption caused by the plague, many of these political evolutions may have taken centuries longer. The answer to the title question, "How did the Black Death change Europe forever?" emerges not only in summary but through these intertwined threads. The transformation of labor, society, economy, culture, religion, politics, and even psychological consciousness. The pandemic forced Europe to confront mortality, adapt to scarcity, and innovate in ways that redefined what was possible. From individual households to cities, from artistic workshops to trading ports, the plague left a permanent imprint on daily life, social structures, and collective mindset. Its effects rippled through centuries, shaping the Renaissance, fueling exploration, and creating a Europe that was more resilient, creative, and self-aware than before. The ripple effects can be traced in countless aspects of European life. In the rebuilt marketplaces of Florence, a young artisan who survived the plague could rise from apprentice to master more quickly than in pre-plague society, shaping trade, art, and local politics. In England, peasants could negotiate wages and mobility that had previously been unimaginable, slowly eroding rigid feudal hierarchies and empowering common people. In Spain and Portugal, wealth concentrated in the hands of survivors fueled investment in exploration and overseas trade, connecting Europe to distant continents. In churches across Germany and France, sermons emphasized morality, compassion, and mortality, reflecting a populace acutely aware of life's fragility. Every aspect of Europe, from economy to culture, politics to spirituality, bore the mark of the plague, forever. In small villages across France, Survivors faced the haunting reality of abandoned homes, empty fields, and the echoing absence of entire families. Children, often orphaned, were taken in by extended relatives or neighbors, sometimes forming new households that had to merge traditions, property, and resources. Imagine a young boy in Burgundy, walking past a neighbor's silent cottage where no one remains, and learning at an early age how vital skill, resilience, and cooperation are for survival. These experiences were formative, reshaping social norms around family, labor, and community. Communities adapted by consolidating farmland, pooling livestock, and reorganizing local governance. Villagers learned to value each life more intensely, to negotiate labor and resources more fairly, and to pass on knowledge that would help future generations survive similar disasters. In urban centers, life was chaotic yet adaptive. Florence, Venice, and Paris experienced massive depopulation, but the survivors rebuilt workshops, markets, and neighborhoods with new strategies. Artisans who survived were thrust into positions of responsibility, taking over businesses or guilds previously dominated by now-deceased masters. Merchants who remained gained unprecedented leverage in trade negotiations. Apprenticeships were reorganized, contracts rewritten, and skill training accelerated to maintain economic continuity. In Venice, canals that had silted or been neglected during the height of the plague were restored, warehouses rebuilt, and trade networks carefully managed to ensure goods could flow across the Mediterranean. Urban planning began to account for sanitation and population density, the early seeds of public health systems emerging as practical responses to trauma. The Black Death's psychological impact also played a profound role in Europe's transformation. Survivors developed an acute awareness of mortality that influenced behavior, culture, and social norms. Festivals, weddings, and religious ceremonies were celebrated with renewed intensity as life's fragility became ever more apparent. Art and literature reflected these attitudes. The dance macabre, or dance of death, became a recurring motif, depicting individuals of all social classes confronted by mortality. Painters and sculptors emphasized realism, human emotion, and the interplay of life and death. Writers explored morality, human ingenuity, and the challenge of navigating a world forever altered by disease. Music adapted as well, with somber laments interwoven with celebratory hymns and festival songs, reminding communities that mourning and hope coexist. Economically, Europe was transformed in ways that reverberated for centuries. Labor scarcity empowered peasants and workers to demand higher wages and improved conditions. Land ownership patterns shifted as surviving families consolidated property, creating wealth and opportunities for social mobility previously unavailable. Urban economies adapted, guilds restructured, trade networks expanded, and capital accumulation allowed investment in shipping, banking, and commerce. These economic adjustments directly facilitated European expansion and exploration, as merchants and nobles invested in voyages, colonies, and overseas trade, enabled by wealth concentrated among those who survived the plague. Agricultural practices shifted as well. Fields once dedicated solely to grain were converted to pasture and vineyards. Livestock became more central to wealth and sustenance, and labor-saving innovations were adopted more widely. Culturally, the Black Death reshaped Europe's intellectual and artistic landscape. Renaissance humanism, which emphasized individual potential, empirical observation, and classical learning, emerged in a society profoundly aware of life's fragility. Survivors, seeking meaning and control, invested in education, arts, and philosophy. Artists like Giotto and Masaccio studied human anatomy and emotion, depicting grief and hope with unprecedented depth. Writers and chroniclers captured the nuances of human behavior under extreme conditions, from moral courage to desperation, weaving lessons from survival into broader narratives. Scientific curiosity, in fields like medicine and astronomy, began to take root as scholars questioned traditional authority and sought empirical solutions. driven by the harsh lessons of the pandemic. Religion, too, was permanently affected. The Church's inability to prevent or mitigate the Black Death led many to question its authority, while personal piety and moral introspection became more prominent. Pilgrimages, processions, and rituals continued, but personal prayer and reflection gained importance. This spiritual shift laid foundations for later reform movements, including the Protestant Reformation, which emphasized individual conscience and challenged hierarchical authority. In essence, the Black Death reshaped not only how people lived, but how they thought about morality, mortality, and divine providence. Political structures evolved as well. Monarchs and city-states confronted depopulation, economic disruption, and social unrest. Bureaucratic reforms, revised taxation systems, and new labor laws emerged out of necessity. Feudal obligations weakened, while urban centers gained influence. Centralized states became more capable of administration, capable of managing trade, labor, and population in ways unimaginable before the pandemic. The lessons of flexibility, adaptation, and responsiveness learned in the wake of catastrophe would influence European governance for centuries. Exploration and global expansion, while temporally distant from the plague itself, were indirect consequences of these transformations. Wealth concentrated among survivors allowed investment in ships, crews, and overseas ventures. Intellectual curiosity and a willingness to take calculated risks were hallmarks of a society that had endured unpredictability on a massive scale. Portugal and Spain sponsored voyages that connected Europe to Africa, the Americas, and Asia. These ventures reshaped global trade, introduced new resources and cultures to European societies, and further amplified the long-term consequences of the Black Death. Thus, when we return to the central question, how did the Black Death change Europe forever? The answer emerges with clarity, richness, and depth. The pandemic reshaped demographics, redistributing population and empowering survivors. Economically, it drove innovation, strengthened urban economies, and facilitated global expansion. Socially, it weakened feudal hierarchies, altered family structures, and enhanced community cohesion. Culturally, it inspired art, literature, music, and intellectual inquiry focused on human experience, mortality, and resilience. Religiously, it shifted spiritual focus toward personal devotion and reflection while questioning institutional authority. Politically, it strengthened governance, centralized states, and promoted adaptability. Psychologically, it instilled awareness of fragility, resilience, and the potential for human innovation in the face of catastrophe. The Black Death, in sum, was a crucible that forged a Europe profoundly different, capable of transformation, creativity, and growth that would shape history for centuries. In the northern Italian city of Siena, survivors faced the eerie emptiness of streets where once bustling markets had been filled with merchants and artisans. Chroniclers describe families navigating deserted neighborhoods, counting the dead among neighbors and friends. Wealth and property were suddenly concentrated among fewer survivors, creating opportunities for social mobility and new economic strategies. Artisans who remained gained unprecedented prominence, and guilds restructured to accommodate both the shortage of skilled labor and the influx of ambitious apprentices. Banks and merchant houses adapted as well, investing in new trade routes and consolidating wealth. The result was a city that, though scarred by mortality, became more dynamic, innovative, and socially fluid than before. In rural England, the impact of the Black Death was equally transformative but different in character. Villages were depopulated, sometimes losing over half their inhabitants. Surviving peasants discovered they had leverage that had been unimaginable before the plague. They could demand higher wages, negotiate freedom from certain feudal obligations, or even acquire land previously controlled by wealthier families. Families consolidated farms, pooled resources, and reorganized labor to ensure survival. Children who had survived, often orphaned, learned the value of adaptability, cooperation, and skill in ways that shaped the next generation's social expectations. Over time, These shifts contributed to the weakening of the feudal system and created a more flexible rural economy, with labor and land increasingly responsive to demographic realities. In France, both urban and rural areas demonstrated remarkable resilience. Cities such as Lyon and Paris faced repeated outbreaks, forcing inhabitants to reorganize trade, markets, and infrastructure. Rural regions experienced depopulation, abandoned villages, and shifts in agricultural practices. Survivors adapted by consolidating farmland, converting arable fields to pasture or vineyards, and introducing labor-saving techniques. Wealth concentrated in the hands of survivors allowed for cultural and educational investment, fostering local schools, religious institutions, and artistic endeavors. Even in regions far from urban centers, the psychological impact of surviving mass mortality influenced community cohesion, values, and decision-making. Northern Europe, including the Hanseatic League cities and Scandinavian towns, experienced a unique set of transformations. Towns such as Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bergen strengthened trade networks to maintain economic continuity despite labor shortages. Urban authorities implemented rudimentary public health measures, regulated markets, and ensured the flow of essential goods. In rural Scandinavia, depopulated villages reorganized communal structures, shared labor, and relied on cooperative networks to survive. Across these regions, the Black Death accelerated social and economic adaptation, teaching communities that survival required cooperation, foresight, and flexibility. Economically, the Black Death's consequences reshaped the European continent. Scarcity of labor empowered workers to negotiate better conditions and wages, both in cities and on rural estates. Land ownership patterns shifted as surviving families consolidated property, while abandoned estates were absorbed by wealthier households or urban institutions. Urban economies reorganized around surviving artisans, merchants, and skilled laborers. Trade networks expanded, guilds adapted to new labor realities, and capital accumulation enabled investment in shipping, banking, and commerce. Agricultural practices changed dramatically. Grain fields were partially converted to pasture, vineyards expanded, and livestock management became more central. These shifts improved per capita wealth and allowed survivors to fund artistic, educational, and exploratory ventures that would define Europe's future. Cultural consequences of the plague were equally profound. Art, literature, and music reflected the trauma of mass mortality while simultaneously celebrating human resilience. The dance macabre motif, appearing in painting, sculpture, and performance, illustrated the universality of death while emphasizing human dignity and moral reflection. Writers like Boccaccio explored human behavior under extreme stress, chronicling both folly and courage. Music incorporated laments alongside celebratory hymns, reflecting a society grappling with grief yet affirming life. Philosophers and scholars began to question traditional authority, emphasizing observation, empirical reasoning, and human agency, attitudes directly informed by the experience of surviving catastrophe. Religious practice evolved alongside cultural expression. While traditional rituals, pilgrimages, and processions persisted, individuals increasingly emphasized personal devotion, moral reflection, and introspection. Skepticism toward clerical authority grew, particularly as the Church had been unable to prevent or explain the catastrophe. This spiritual questioning, seeded by the Black Death, laid the foundation for the intellectual and theological ferment of the Reformation. Faith became both more personal and more reflective, and ethical responsibility gained prominence in the social consciousness. Politically, the plague had long-term consequences for governance and social organization. Monarchs and city-states, confronted with depopulated territories, reorganized taxation, labor law, and administration to maintain order and productivity. Urban centers gained autonomy and influence, while centralized governments emerged with greater bureaucratic sophistication. The decline of feudal obligations, accelerated by labor scarcity, created flexibility in governance and strengthened adaptive capacities. These lessons of administration, drawn from the harsh realities of plague recovery, shaped political structures well into the early modern period. The ripple effects of the Black Death extended into Europe's expansionist ambitions. Wealth concentrated among survivors and cities enabled investment in ships, crews, and overseas ventures. Intellectual curiosity, tolerance for risk, and ambition, qualities forged during decades of survival, drove explorers to venture across oceans, connecting Europe with Africa, the Americas, and Asia. Portugal, Spain, and later, the Dutch and English empires expanded trade networks, created colonies, and transformed global exchange. In this sense, the Black Death did not only reshape Europe internally, but also set the stage for its outward transformation, influencing global history. The central question, how did the Black Death change Europe forever, can be answered in multiple interrelated ways. The pandemic transformed demographics, redistributing population and empowering survivors. Economically, it redefined labor, land ownership, trade, and wealth accumulation. Socially, it reshaped family structures, community organization, and social mobility. Culturally, it inspired artistic, literary, musical, and intellectual innovation that emphasized mortality, resilience, and human potential. Religiously, it fostered personal devotion, moral reflection, and institutional questioning. Politically, it strengthened governance, centralized authority, and promoted adaptive management. Psychologically, it left Europe acutely aware of fragility, risk, and the possibilities inherent in resilience. The Black Death, in short, was a crucible, a catastrophe that destroyed millions but simultaneously reshaped Europe forever. In the Italian city of Florence, the plague left streets eerily empty, workshops abandoned, and homes shuttered. Survivors like Marco, a young apprentice in a goldsmith's workshop, found themselves thrust into responsibility far beyond their years. With his master dead, Marco had to manage accounts, source materials, and maintain relationships with clients, all while navigating a city still haunted by loss. Such experiences were common across urban centers. Scarcity of labor and wealth consolidation allowed younger or lower-ranking individuals to rise quickly, reshaping social hierarchies and guild structures. Apprenticeships accelerated, merchants expanded networks, and banks innovated financial practices to stabilize commerce. The resulting urban resilience not only restored daily life, but also laid the foundations for Italy's cultural and economic renaissance. In rural England, the consequences of the Black Death were similarly profound, but took on a different character. Villages along the Thames and in East Anglia were depopulated, with entire communities reduced to a fraction of their pre-plague population. Labor scarcity empowered peasants. They could demand better wages, negotiate freedom from certain feudal obligations, and in some cases, acquire land previously held by wealthier families. One chronicler recounted a village where the local lord, desperate for workers, agreed to new labor contracts granting peasants mobility and higher compensation. Families consolidated farms and shared labor to maximize productivity, while orphan children often formed new households with neighbors or extended relatives. This restructuring eroded feudal rigidity, increased social mobility, and transformed rural life in ways that would ripple across generations. In France, both urban and rural adaptations were remarkable. Cities such as Lyon and Paris had to reorganize trade, markets, and governance to maintain economic stability. Guilds adapted to the sudden loss of skilled artisans, introducing flexible training programs for apprentices and restructuring labor hierarchies. Rural areas faced depopulated farmland, abandoned villages, and reorganized communal labor. Agricultural practices shifted. Pasture replaced some grain fields, vineyards expanded, and livestock management grew in importance. Wealth concentrated in the hands of survivors allowed investment in education, local governance, and cultural projects. Communities became more tightly knit, relying on cooperation and mutual support for survival. Northern Europe and Scandinavia also tell a story of adaptation and resilience. Towns within the Hanseatic League, such as Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bergen, reorganized trade networks and implemented early public health measures to prevent future outbreaks. Merchants strengthened alliances, monitored shipping routes, and maintained economic continuity despite workforce reductions. In rural Scandinavia, survivors shared labor cooperatively, pooling resources and maintaining villages that might otherwise have vanished. These experiences created a culture of practical problem-solving, foresight, and collective responsibility that shaped Northern European society for generations. Economically, the Black Death transformed labor, wealth, and production across the continent. Scarce labor meant that workers could negotiate wages and mobility. Surviving peasants could acquire land and assert greater influence. Urban economies adapted to a smaller workforce by restructuring guilds, improving efficiency, and investing in commerce. Agricultural shifts included converting grain fields to pasture, expanding vineyards, and emphasizing livestock management. Trade networks reorganized and capital accumulation increased, enabling investments in overseas exploration, infrastructure, and urban development. In effect, the demographic shock created opportunities for economic innovation that would resonate for centuries. Culturally, the plague's imprint was profound. Artists depicted mortality, resilience, and human emotion with new realism. Frescoes, altarpieces, and manuscripts illustrated the fragility of life and the value of virtue. Music evolved to reflect grief and celebration simultaneously, with laments accompanying festive hymns. Writers and scholars explored human behavior under extreme circumstances, emphasizing morality, ingenuity, and the pursuit of knowledge. The trauma of the Black Death cultivated a mindset that prized human creativity, reflection, and critical inquiry, qualities central to the Renaissance. Religion, too, evolved in response to the pandemic. Clerical failure to prevent or explain the plague prompted some to intensify devotion, while others questioned church authority. Pilgrimages and rituals persisted, but personal piety, ethical reflection, and moral responsibility became more central. This transformation in religious thought set the stage for the Reformation, encouraging individuals to seek personal understanding of faith and morality, and challenging hierarchical authority. Politically, governance adapted to post-plague realities. Monarchs and city-states reformed taxation, labor laws, and administrative practices to respond to depopulation and social unrest. Urban centers gained influence, and centralized states became capable of managing complex populations and economic systems. Labor scarcity forced rulers to negotiate with peasants and artisans, creating flexible and responsive governance structures. These adaptations shaped the political evolution of Europe, laying the groundwork for early modern state formation. The Black Death also indirectly catalyzed Europe's age of exploration. Wealth concentrated among survivors funded ships, crews, and navigation ventures. Intellectual curiosity, risk tolerance, and ambition, qualities honed during decades of survival, drove explorers across oceans, connecting Europe to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Portugal, Spain, and later, the Dutch and English empires expanded trade networks, established colonies, and reshaped global economic and cultural exchanges. The demographic and economic transformations caused by the plague made such global expansion possible, linking European recovery directly to the rise of overseas empires. The Black Death was not merely a moment of tragic mortality. It functioned as a catalyst that forced Europe to confront fundamental vulnerabilities in every system it had taken for granted. Demographically, the continent experienced unprecedented population collapse, with estimates suggesting that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population perished. This collapse was not uniform. Dense urban centers suffered tremendous losses, while some rural areas faced depopulation at a slower, but no less catastrophic rate. The result was a reshaping of human geography. Villages disappeared, cities were rebuilt, and labor became a precious resource. Survivors suddenly found themselves in a society where scarcity granted power and opportunity in ways previously unimaginable. Laborers could negotiate wages, peasants could acquire land, and guilds had to restructure to accommodate both shortages and new social dynamics. Economically, the Black Death disrupted long-standing structures of production, trade, and wealth distribution. Agriculture, once reliant on abundant peasant labor, shifted toward efficiency, with increased use of livestock and pasture, reduction of marginal fields, and the consolidation of estates. Artisan and merchant classes in cities adapted by restructuring apprenticeships, increasing specialization, and consolidating capital. Trade networks, both local and international, were strengthened through necessity, as surviving merchants sought to maintain continuity and profit in the face of workforce shortages and economic instability. These economic transformations had long-term consequences, facilitating the growth of urban centers, enabling capital accumulation, and indirectly supporting the rise of the Renaissance and Europe's later expansion into global trade networks. Socially, the Black Death permanently altered the fabric of European communities. Traditional feudal hierarchies weakened as labor scarcity allowed peasants and artisans to demand better conditions, mobility, and rights. Family structures adapted. Orphan children were absorbed into extended households. Neighbors collaborated to maintain survival, and communal ties strengthened. A psychological awareness of mortality permeated society, creating an ethos of pragmatism, resilience, and foresight. Communities that had survived the plague became more cohesive in some ways, yet more questioning of authority in others. These social adaptations laid the groundwork for the gradual transformation of European society from rigid feudal hierarchies to more dynamic, flexible, and mobile social structures. Culturally, Europe's response to the Black Death was profound and enduring. Art, literature, and music absorbed the trauma of mass mortality and translated it into creative innovation. The dance macabre motif, for example, became a pervasive reminder of human fragility, while frescoes, sculptures, and manuscripts increasingly emphasized realism, emotion, and moral reflection. Writers such as Boccaccio documented both tragedy and survival, exploring human behavior under extreme stress. Music captured the duality of grief and celebration, teaching communities to acknowledge loss while affirming life. Intellectual curiosity grew as scholars, physicians, and thinkers sought empirical understanding of disease, mortality, and human resilience. These cultural responses were not mere expressions of grief. They were adaptations, shaping Europe's consciousness and creative output for centuries. Religiously, the Black Death provoked both intensified devotion and skepticism toward institutional authority. The Church's inability to prevent or cure the disease led many to question clerical power, while others sought solace in personal faith and moral reflection. Pilgrimages and processions continued, but personal prayer and introspection gained prominence. The spiritual consequences of the plague created a cultural environment in which individual conscience and personal interpretation of morality became increasingly important, setting the stage for later reform movements and theological inquiry. Politically, Europe adapted to the challenges posed by depopulation and social upheaval. Labor shortages forced rulers to negotiate with peasants, merchants, and urban authorities. Centralized states emerged with greater bureaucratic capacity to manage taxation, labor, and governance. Urban centers gained influence as hubs of commerce, culture, and political negotiation. These shifts created a political landscape more responsive, flexible, and capable of managing crisis, an enduring transformation that affected governance across Europe for centuries. Finally, one of the most striking and often overlooked consequences of the Black Death was the psychological and intellectual shift it created. Survivors experienced a collective awareness of human fragility, mortality, and uncertainty that reshaped decision-making, ambition, and social priorities. Life became simultaneously more precarious and more precious, fostering innovation, risk-taking, and investment in human potential. From the rebuilding of cities to the flourishing of art and exploration, the Black Death created a Europe that was more resilient, adaptable, and forward-looking than it had been before. Viewed from this perspective, the question of how the Black Death changed Europe forever can be answered as a series of systemic transformations. Demographic collapse reshaped labor and population distribution. Economic restructuring enabled urban growth and global trade. Social adaptation weakened feudal hierarchies and strengthened communal bonds. Cultural innovation reflected both mortality and resilience. Religious practice evolved toward personal conscience and moral reflection. Political systems became more centralized and adaptive, and psychological awareness of risk and mortality created a society more capable of transformation. The Black Death, in essence, was the crucible in which medieval Europe was forged into a new world, one that would carry its lessons into the Renaissance, Reformation, and global exploration. In Florence, the Black Death reshaped not only society, but also the very imagination of its inhabitants. Families who had survived the plague often channeled their grief and fortune into cultural projects. A young artist named Lorenzo, orphaned when his parents succumbed to the disease, inherited a modest workshop from a relative. The scarcity of skilled artisans meant Lorenzo quickly assumed the role of master, training apprentices and producing works that combined meticulous craftsmanship with a newfound intensity of emotional realism. Paintings and sculptures began to depict not only religious themes, but also the fragility, suffering, and resilience of human life. Across Italy, such patterns were common. Survivors invested wealth and energy into art, education, and architecture, creating a cultural flowering that defined the Renaissance. The Black Death, by removing large segments of the population, inadvertently concentrated talent and capital among those who remained, allowing human creativity to flourish in unprecedented ways. In England, the plague's economic and social consequences were profound. Villages depopulated by disease offered surviving laborers unprecedented bargaining power. A young peasant, Thomas, who had inherited his family's small holding, could now negotiate fair wages with his lord, purchase additional land, and ensure security for his children. Over decades, these shifts weakened the feudal system, increasing social mobility and transforming rural life. Urban centers like London and York reorganized markets and guilds to address the shortage of skilled labor. Merchants expanded trade networks, and artisans innovated to maintain production. Economic adaptation, spurred by demographic collapse, set the stage for the rise of a more dynamic, capitalist-oriented economy in later centuries. Across northern Europe, in Hanseatic League cities like Lübeck and Hamburg, merchants responded to the Black Death by consolidating trade routes and diversifying goods. Labor shortages prompted investment in technology and efficiency. City leaders implemented rudimentary public health measures, quarantine regulations, and sanitation initiatives to prevent further outbreaks. Rural areas, depopulated and restructured, relied on cooperative labor networks and shared governance, ensuring that even remote communities could survive economic and social disruption. These adaptations strengthened resilience and fostered a culture of practical problem-solving, laying the foundation for Northern Europe's commercial and administrative sophistication. Culturally, the Black Death had enduring effects on European consciousness. Literature reflected the tension between mortality and hope. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the plague's aftermath, captured both the horror of death and the ingenuity of survivors, illustrating human behavior under extreme stress. Music and performance evolved to combine mourning with celebration, providing communities a shared outlet for grief and resilience. Artistic expression increasingly emphasized realism, emotion, and moral reflection. Public and private rituals incorporated remembrance, contemplation, and acknowledgement of mortality, embedding the psychological impact of the plague into the cultural memory of Europe. Religious life was permanently transformed. The Church, unable to prevent the Black Death, faced scrutiny and declining moral authority in some regions. While many turned to intensified devotion, others embraced personal piety and ethical reflection outside of institutional control. Pilgrimages, processions, and rituals continued, but introspective spirituality gained prominence. This shift laid the groundwork for the Reformation, as individuals began to question hierarchical authority and emphasize personal conscience. European spirituality evolved, reflecting both trauma and adaptation, and fostering moral and intellectual growth in the centuries that followed. Politically, rulers learned that demographic collapse required flexibility and innovation. Monarchs and city-states reorganized taxation, labor laws, and administrative systems to maintain stability. Centralized states with capable bureaucracies emerged, capable of managing population, trade, and labor shortages effectively. Urban centers gained influence, serving as hubs of commerce, negotiation, and governance. Labor scarcity forced negotiation and social compromise, creating a political landscape that was more responsive and resilient. These shifts influenced European governance well into the early modern period. Perhaps the most striking long-term consequence of the Black Death was psychological. Survivors developed an acute awareness of mortality, scarcity, and opportunity. Life became more precious, and human potential more evident. Innovation, creativity, and risk-taking flourished, as individuals and communities had seen firsthand that disaster could strike unpredictably, but survival was possible. This psychological shift influenced art, commerce, exploration, and science for generations. Europe's post-plague society became more adaptable, ambitious, and conscious of the fragility of life, qualities that drove the Renaissance, global exploration, and intellectual advancement. Even exploration and overseas expansion can be traced to the transformations wrought by the plague. Wealth concentrated among survivors, urban centers, and merchant classes allowed for investment in ships, crews, and navigation. Intellectual curiosity and tolerance for risk, developed through decades of adaptation and survival, inspired voyages to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Portugal, Spain, and later, the Dutch and English empires expanded trade networks and colonies, connecting Europe to the wider world. The demographic, economic, and cultural consequences of the Black Death made this expansion possible, showing that the pandemic's influence extended far beyond immediate survival. It reshaped the trajectory of global history. Thus, when reflecting on the central question, how did the Black Death change Europe forever? It becomes clear that its impact was multidimensional and enduring. It altered population distribution and labor dynamics, disrupted economic systems, weakened feudal hierarchies, and facilitated social mobility. It inspired cultural, artistic, and intellectual innovation. It reshaped religious thought and practice. It strengthened political governance and adaptability. Psychologically, it created a consciousness attuned to mortality, risk, and human potential. In every sense, Europe after the Black Death was a different continent, more resilient, more creative, more mobile, and more capable of transformation. The pandemic was both a catastrophe and a catalyst, a force that destroyed millions of lives but simultaneously reshaped the social, economic, cultural, and political foundations of Europe forever. As we reflect on the centuries that followed the Black Death, it becomes clear that its consequences were both immediate and enduring, touching every facet of European life. The pandemic was more than a biological event. It was a social, economic, cultural, political, and psychological crucible that reshaped the continent in ways that would reverberate for generations. The sheer scale of mortality, cities emptied, villages vanished, families wiped out, forced Europe to confront fundamental vulnerabilities in ways that had never been necessary before. In the empty streets of Florence, The abandoned villages of Normandy, the depopulated farms of England, and the silent ports of Venice, survivors faced the stark reality of human fragility. And yet, in the midst of such despair, they also found opportunity, resilience, and the capacity for reinvention. Survivors were thrust into positions of unprecedented responsibility. Young apprentices inherited workshops, peasants gained bargaining power over labor and land, merchants consolidated trade and wealth, and urban authorities adapted to maintain civic order. These individual experiences, repeated across countless towns and villages, aggregated into systemic transformations. Labor, once taken for granted, became a valuable resource. Skills and knowledge were treasured and transmitted with newfound urgency. Communities redefined themselves, pooling resources, consolidating families, and reshaping social structures. Feudal hierarchies weakened, social mobility increased, and individuals, once powerless, found themselves shaping the fate of families, villages, and cities. In this sense, survival was not merely a matter of endurance. It was a catalyst for empowerment, innovation, and societal evolution. Economically, the continent emerged transformed. Scarcity of labor forced innovation in agriculture. Fields were consolidated, crop patterns diversified, and livestock became central to subsistence and commerce. Urban economies reorganized around surviving artisans, guilds adapted to shortages, and merchants strengthened local and international trade networks. Wealth concentrated among survivors allowed for investment in infrastructure, education, and culture, laying the foundation for the growth of cities and the rise of a merchant and artisan class that would dominate European economic life for centuries. In essence, the Black Death rewired Europe's economic system, creating conditions for both recovery and future expansion, including the extraordinary ventures of global exploration that would follow in the next centuries. Culturally, the Black Death's imprint was equally profound. Art, literature, and music absorbed the trauma of mortality while celebrating human ingenuity and resilience. The dance macabre became a recurring motif, reminding all that death was universal, yet life carried meaning and value. Writers chronicled both the horror and heroism of survival, capturing moral dilemmas, courage, and human creativity in the face of devastation. Music evolved, blending grief with hope, and performance became a communal space where life, death, and morality intersected. The experience of the pandemic instilled a heightened awareness of human potential, of the need to act decisively, and of the fleeting nature of life, a consciousness that directly influenced the flourishing of the Renaissance. Artistic and intellectual endeavors, driven by both loss and opportunity, created a Europe more reflective, imaginative, and self-aware than ever before. Religious life, too, was irrevocably altered. The Church's inability to prevent or mitigate the plague led to scrutiny, and in some areas, a crisis of faith. Many turned toward personal devotion, moral reflection, and ethical responsibility. Pilgrimages and rituals persisted, yet the focus on individual conscience and spiritual introspection grew. This evolution in religious thought would later feed into broader movements, including the Reformation, emphasizing personal agency, moral responsibility, and the questioning of hierarchical authority. Faith, shaped by trauma, became both more personal and more socially consequential, reflecting the lessons learned from the shared experience of survival. Politically, governance adapted to new realities. Monarchs and city-states faced depopulation, labor scarcity, and economic disruption. Centralized administrations emerged capable of collecting taxes, regulating labor, and maintaining order more efficiently. Urban centers gained influence, serving as hubs of commerce, civic organization, and political negotiation. Labor shortages required rulers to negotiate with peasants, artisans, and merchants, creating more responsive and adaptable governance structures. These political transformations, born of necessity, strengthened the capacity of European states to navigate subsequent challenges, setting the stage for the complex and centralized political systems of the early modern period. Perhaps most enduringly, the Black Death reshaped European psychology. Survivors developed a heightened awareness of mortality, fragility, and uncertainty. Life, once assumed to be predictable, was now recognized as fleeting and precarious. This consciousness fostered innovation, risk-taking, and ambition. Artists, merchants, scholars, and explorers, all influenced by the lessons of survival, pursued ventures that would redefine European civilization. Human creativity, previously constrained by rigid social hierarchies, found room to flourish. Communities, having endured unimaginable trauma, learned adaptability, resilience, and cooperation. The psychological legacy of the plague, though born in fear and grief, created a society capable of transformation on a scale unprecedented in human history. The long-term consequences of the Black Death extend far beyond the immediate aftermath of mortality. It reshaped population distribution, altered labor relations, accelerated economic innovation, and fostered social mobility. It inspired cultural and intellectual flourishing, transformed religious consciousness, and strengthened political adaptability. It instilled in Europe a heightened awareness of risk, opportunity, and human potential. Even the course of global history, exploration, colonization, and trade, was influenced by the demographic, economic, and psychological transformations triggered by the pandemic. In every sense, Europe after the Black Death was a new continent, forged through catastrophe, refined by survival, and transformed by the indelible lessons of loss. So when we return to the central question, how did the Black Death change Europe forever? The answer is both tragic and remarkable. It changed Europe forever by dismantling old structures, forcing innovation, and creating a consciousness attuned to mortality, resilience, and opportunity. It empowered survivors, reshaped economies, inspired art and literature, transformed faith, redefined politics, and rewired human perception. Europe was forever altered not simply because of the lives lost, but because the survivors carried forward knowledge, experience, and insight that reshaped the world itself. The Black Death, though a cataclysm, became a turning point, a moment in which the continent was simultaneously humbled by mortality and elevated by the capacity for adaptation, creativity, and enduring transformation. In the end, the story of the Black Death is a story of human resilience. It is a story of survival, adaptation, and the extraordinary capacity of societies to recover, innovate, and thrive even after unimaginable loss. It is a reminder that catastrophe, while destructive, can also be transformative, and that humanity's response, our creativity, cooperation, and courage, can reshape the course of history. Europe, scarred but strengthened, emerged from the Black Death forever changed, a continent more dynamic, reflective, and resilient than it had ever been before. The lessons of that era, engraved in art, literature, faith, politics, and human consciousness, continue to echo, reminding us that even in the darkest moments, the potential for renewal and growth endures. If you enjoyed this exploration, if it sparked your curiosity, or if you feel inspired by the resilience of those who survived the Black Death, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps support this content and ensures more people can discover these stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you can join us for future journeys into history, uncovering the incredible events, people, and transformations that shape the world we live in today. And please leave a comment or share your thoughts. What surprised you most about how Europe changed after the Black Death? Which story, which city, or which transformation resonated with you? I love reading your reflections and engaging with your ideas because history is a conversation, not just a narration. Thank you for being here, for giving your attention to the lives and experiences of people who lived through one of the most challenging periods in human history. Thank you for letting these stories unfold with you, and for carrying forward a curiosity that honors both the suffering and the resilience of those who came before us. Every like, every comment, and every subscription helps us continue to bring these stories to life, and together, we can explore the richness of our shared past. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being part of this journey. Stay curious, stay reflective, and remember, history is not just about dates and events. It is about people, choices, resilience, and the enduring capacity of humanity to learn, adapt, and grow. I hope you walk away today not only with knowledge, but also with inspiration, understanding, and a connection to the countless lives that shaped the Europe we know today. And as always, thank you for listening, for watching, and for being part of this adventure. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share, and I can't wait to explore the next chapter of history with you.